You ever come across one of those situations where someone thinks they're tough, real bold, until they mess with the wrong person? Yeah, this story, it's exactly that. Two guys, loud as their bikes, thinking they ruled the road, until they met someone who didn't need to raise his voice to make his point. It all started on a hot Thursday evening, late summer, the kind of day where the pavement's still warm long after the sun's dipped behind the hills. The truck stop on Route 17 was buzzing, drivers stretching their legs, grabbing burgers, talking about the road. But among the usual crowd were two bikers, leather vests, sleeveless shirts, that kind of attitude that says, "We don't care. Who's watching?" And that's exactly the problem. They wanted people to watch. Now, these weren't regular guys enjoying a ride. No, these two had a habit, provoking, showing off, trying to get reactions. Some folks ignore it, some laugh it off. But today, they picked the wrong guy. The truck was a beast. Big, red, polished chrome glinting under the lot lights. Before we jump back in, tell me, where are you watching this video from below? And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's episode is extra special. It was parked at the edge of the rest area, engine quiet. The driver was inside, probably eating a sandwich or reading the map like old school road warriors do. But the bikers, they saw that truck as a challenge. One of them, let's call him Jake, smirked and said, "Bet that guy thinks he's king of the road." His buddy Troy chuckled. "Maybe we should teach him who really owns the asphalt." You could already tell they weren't looking to talk. They wanted to poke the bear, so they started revving their bikes, circling the truck. Close, too close, like wasps buzzing around a picnic table. They revved louder, leaning on their horns, hoping to get a rise, but nothing, no movement from the cab, no words shouted back, just silence, and silence for people like that is worse than yelling. It makes them want to push harder. Jake called. "Yo, truckman, you asleep or scared?" Still no answer. A few truckers nearby shook their heads, recognizing what was happening, the kind of young bravado that crashes into reality real fast. Troy wasn't done. He spat near the wheel well. "This rig ain't even that nice. All show, no go." Then, without warning, the truck's headlights flicked on. Not a sound before that, just click. The whole lot paused. A couple of the guys near the diner window turned to look. The air shifted. You know that moment when something's about to go down? That was it. The engine rumbled alive, not in a hurry, not aggressive, just deliberate, smooth, like a bear stretching its limbs after a nap. The bikers backed up a bit, unsure now. Jake still had a grin on his face, but you could see it twitching. Then the truck inched forward, not fast, not even enough to be considered a threat, but just enough to make a point. The front bumper creeped ahead, inch by inch, almost whispering, "I'm aware, and I'm not here to play." Troy called out, "Yo, chill, man. Just having fun." But the truck didn't stop, just kept rolling, straight, smooth, no horns, no flashes, like the driver wasn't trying to chase anyone, just reclaim his space. Now here's the part that turned things around. Jake stepped forward like he was about to flex, but his bike wobbled slightly on the stand. He caught himself, barely, but everyone saw it. His confidence cracked for a split second. That was all it took. The truck came to a full stop, maybe 3 feet from where they were standing. Still no shouting, still no chaos. Just presence. Calm, calculated presence. The kind that says, "I've seen roads you've never dreamed of. Don't test me." The driver didn't even open the door, just sat there, engine humming, lights on, letting the silence speak louder than any engine roar. You could feel the shift in the air. The bikers, suddenly not so loud, exchanged glances. Troy muttered something under his breath and nudged his bike backward. Jake followed, pretending it was all part of the joke. "Whatever, man," he said, loud enough for people to hear. "Ain't worth it." But the thing is, it wasn't a joke anymore. They knew it. Everyone watching knew it. That driver hadn't done anything dramatic. No yelling, no threats, no cops. He just let the truck speak for him. And in that moment, it said everything. As the bikers pulled away, the truck backed gently into its original spot. Headlights off, engine still running. It wasn't about scaring them, it was about setting a line, one that didn't need neon signs or loud voices. Just experience, quiet authority, a reminder that the road is long and respect goes further than ego. What those bikers didn't know is that Trucker wasn't just any driver. Stories go around. Some say he's been on the road 30 years, drove through blizzards, tornadoes, even helped rescue folks after a pile-up on I-90. But he doesn't talk about it, doesn't need to. His actions are loud enough. See, that's the difference between boys who play tough and men who know what toughness really means. The bikers wanted a reaction, maybe a chase, maybe a fight. What they got instead was a lesson, delivered quiet, steady, and unforgettable. By the time the sun dipped fully below the hills, the lot was quiet again. A few murmurs, a few chuckles, but no one said much. Everyone just went back to their meals, their fuel-ups, their maps, except now they had a story of two bikers, full of fire, who tried to light up the wrong spark, and the man behind the wheel who didn't need to move fast. Because when you've earned your place on the road, you don't chase respect, you command it. The truck stop slowly returned to normal after the bikers left. Forks clinked against plates, coffee poured. Conversations picked up again, but everyone had something new to talk about now. The two bikers, once the loudest in the lot, had turned into nothing more than a side note in someone else's story. But inside that truck, the man behind the wheel didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He didn't even look their way as they left. He simply exhaled, shut the engine off again, and leaned back in his seat. His name was Joe. Just Joe. That's all most people ever got. From him, he'd been hauling freight up and down the country for almost 35 years. Didn't matter what you handed him. Steel beams, frozen fish, or crates of used car parts. If you gave it to Joe, it got where it needed to go. On time. No excuses. No breakdowns. No complaints. But Joe didn't just carry cargo. He carried a story. Years ago, long before those bikers were old enough to buy a six-pack, Joe had another kind of life. He was married once, had a daughter, lived in a little house in Nebraska with a white fence and a gravel driveway. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Until one night, when everything changed. A drunk driver, a two-lane road, and a call from the hospital that shattered everything. Joe survived, his family didn't, and from that moment on, Joe never really went home again. He sold the house, gave away the furniture, took the job that let him keep moving. Because the road, with its noise and its miles and its silence, was the only place that didn't feel like it was closing in on him. That's why he didn't react when those bikers tried to stir him up. Not because he was afraid, but because he'd already lost the most important fight of his life, and no kid on a motorcycle trying to act tough could ever match that kind of pain. So he stayed calm, because there's no need to bark when you've already felt the worst the world can throw at you. Later that night, when the sun was gone and the stars blinked above the quiet highway, the bikers stopped a few miles down the road. They parked near a gas station, still trying to act like they didn't care, but it was obvious something had changed. Troy looked at Jake and finally said, "Man, I thought he was going to hit us." Jake didn't answer at first. Then, without looking up, he said, "Nah, he knew exactly what he was doing. Didn't need to touch us to win." There was silence for a moment, and then something neither of them expected happened. Another trucker, older, wearing a cap that read Vietnam Vet, walked up to them, chuckling under his breath. "You boys learned something tonight?" he asked. Jake raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The old man smiled. "You met Red Joe, didn't you?" Troy blinked. "Who?" The old man nodded slowly, pointing down the road. "Big red rig. Quiet guy. That man's been driving since before you were born. Helped pull 3 drivers from a burning wreck on the 41. Carried medicine through a snowstorm to a hospital when the roads were closed. Lost his whole family and still never missed a deadline." Jake's jaw tightened. "He don't mess around. But he doesn't have to prove anything either," the old man continued. "He lets his actions speak. Y'all are lucky. He gave you a warning. That's the only one you'll ever get." With that, the old man tipped his cap and walked back to his rig. The bikers sat there in silence, not sure what to say. Meanwhile, back at the truck stop, Joe got out of his cab and walked inside to grab a fresh cup of coffee. He nodded politely at the waitress, exchanged a few quiet words, and tipped more than he owed. He didn't talk about what happened, didn't boast, didn't retell the story, because he knew the road didn't care about stories. The road cared about truth, and the truth was, some people wear loud jackets and rev their engines to feel strong. Others, they wear their strength quietly, like a shadow, like a weight they've carried for years. Joe sat down in a booth, stared out the window and took a sip from his mug. The coffee was hot, the night was calm, and somewhere down the highway, 2 young bikers were learning what it really meant to meet a man who'd already walked through fire and came out the other side without burning others to prove he'd survived. A week had passed since that hot evening at the truck stop. The story of the 2 loud bikers and the silent trucker was still floating around, whispered at diners, joked about at loading docks, passed between drivers like a folktale. But for Joe, it was already behind him. He didn't dwell, he didn't hold grudges, he just kept driving. See, when you live most of your life on the road, things change fast. Towns blur together, weather shifts without warning. And the only thing that stays consistent is the hum of the tires and the weight of your memories. But some lessons, they don't fade so easily. In a dusty town a few hundred miles west, Jake and Troy sat outside a small garage, sipping cold sodas. Their bikes leaned against the side of the building, still loud, still shiny, but somehow quieter, not in sound, but in attitude. They hadn't said much about what happened, not to their crew, not to their girlfriends, not to each other, but both felt it. Something had stuck with them, not just the tension, but the way that man, Joe, hadn't needed to shout to be heard. Jake finally broke the silence. "You ever wonder how he got like that?" he asked. Troy shrugged. "Don't know. Don't think I'd want to go through whatever made him that way." Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah. Me neither." They sat for a while longer. Then Jake stood up and said, "I'm going to ride a bit. Clear my head." Troy smirked. "Don't go looking for any more truckers to mess with." Jake didn't smile back. "I'm not." That evening, Joe pulled into another truck stop. This one quieter, less crowded. No bikers, just a few tired drivers. An old woman pumping gas and a kid playing with a toy car in the dirt. He stepped out, stretched, and walked inside the diner. Ordered a meatloaf plate and sat by the window, watching the twilight crawl across the road. He didn't know it yet, but someone was watching him. Jake had spotted the red rig from a distance. At first, he thought it couldn't be the same one. Lots of trucks were red, lots had chrome, but something about the way it was parked, perfectly straight, lined up on the edge of the lot like it had purpose, made Jake stop. He turned off his bike, took a breath, and walked inside. Joe didn't look up right away, but he felt the presence. You learn to do that after years on the road. Feel a certain energy enter the room, calm or chaos. This was cautious. Jake walked over slowly, helmet in hand. "Hey," he said, voice lower than usual. Joe looked up. He didn't smile. Just waited. Jake shifted his weight. "You probably don't remember me." Joe raised an eyebrow slightly. said nothing. I was one of the guys at that truck stop, with the bike, the one who... He paused, searching for the right words. The one who was being stupid. Joe set down his fork. I remember, he said simply. Jake nodded. Yeah, thought so. There was silence, not uncomfortable, just honest. I didn't come to start anything, Jake added. I've been thinking about it, about you, the way you handled it. I've never seen anyone do that before. Joe leaned back, arms crossed. You came to apologize? Jake swallowed. Yeah, I guess I did. Joe studied him for a second. Then he nodded. Once. Good, Jake blinked. That's it. Joe nodded again. That's it. There was another pause. Then Joe said, You ever drive long distance? Jake shook his head. Joe pointed out the window toward the empty road. You'd be surprised how much you learn when there's nothing around you but miles and your own thoughts. Jake chuckled softly. Sounds like a punishment. Joe smiled faintly. Sometimes it is. Other times it's the only way to grow. Jake looked down, fiddling with his gloves. I've been trying to figure out who you are. Joe shrugged. Doesn't matter who I am. Matters who you decide to be. And with that, he picked up his fork again, calm as ever. Jake stood there a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Thanks for not, smashing us. Joe didn't look up. Didn't need to. Jake turned and left. Outside, Troy was waiting, leaning on his bike. Well, Jake put on his helmet. He remembered me. And? Jake climbed on his bike, kicked it alive. And he didn't need to say much. Again. They rode off into the growing darkness. Not faster, not louder, just steady, quiet, like men trying to learn something new. Back inside, Joe finished his meal, paid in cash, and returned to his rig. He started the engine. The hum filled the air, deep and familiar. As he eased the truck back onto the highway, he saw the bikes in the distance, 2 red taillights shrinking toward the horizon. He nodded once to himself, not because he'd won anything, but because, maybe, just maybe, 2 loud boys had finally started listening, and on the road, that's where all the real lessons begin. Some people think change comes with a loud bang, like thunder or fireworks, but more often it comes quietly. A pause, a decision, a small shift in the road you're on. Jake had been riding a little differently lately. It wasn't something his crew noticed right away. His bike still looked the same. His jacket still carried the same patches. But the way he carried himself, that had changed. He didn't rev at red lights just to prove a point anymore. He didn't eye truckers like they were competition, and he stopped chasing noise. Because now he understood something deeper, something that came not from winning fights, but from surviving them. And it all started with a red rig and a quiet man who didn't need to yell. The road was long, but that gave Jake time to think. Time to reflect. Time to see things he used to miss. So when he and Troy were riding down a stretch of empty highway through New Mexico, the last thing they expected was to pull over for someone else. But there it was. A blue pickup on the shoulder, steam pouring. Out from under the hood, an older man stood beside it, waving a hand toward the sun. His wife sat inside, fanning herself with a folded-up map. Jake slowed down. Troy didn't like it at first. Why stop? He asked, pulling alongside. Jake replied, Because someone once stopped for us. They pulled over, kicked down their stands, and stepped into the heat. The old man looked up, a little surprised, but grateful. Radiator's gone, he explained. We're trying to get to El Paso, but we're not going anywhere in this heat. Jake nodded and crouched down by the truck. Let me take a look. Tools came out of saddlebags. Sweat rolled down their necks. But after 30 minutes of patching and checking hoses, Jake and Troy managed to rig a temporary fix. Enough to get the couple rolling again. The old woman handed them 2 cold bottles of water. People don't stop anymore, she said, softly. Most just drive on by. Jake took a drink. I used to be one of them, he admitted. But someone showed me better. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. Sometimes you can see it in a person's eyes when they've been humbled by the road. As the pickup rumbled away, hazard lights blinking, Troy looked at Jake. He didn't speak, but something in his silence said, "Okay, I get it now." Later that week, they were back on the road again, this time crossing into Texas. They rode smoother now. Less flash, more purpose. They weren't looking for trouble anymore, and they didn't know it, but Joe was out there too. Miles ahead, his red rig gliding over asphalt like a ship across dark water. He'd just passed through a way station. No problems, clean inspection. Another day, another few hundred miles behind him, just how he liked it. But as he merged back onto the highway, he caught a familiar sight in his side mirror. 2 motorcycles in the distance. One of them flashed. Their lights briefly, not in challenge, but in respect. Joe didn't wave. He didn't slow down. He just nodded once, quietly. That was enough. Back at a roadside diner that evening, Joe sat in his usual booth, nursing a hot coffee and staring out into the parking lot. The waitress brought his refill without asking. She'd seen him a few times before, always alone, always polite, always tipping well. Outside the window, a young trucker paced back and forth, yelling into his phone. His rig was parked crookedly, like his whole day had gone sideways. Joe watched a moment longer, then got up and walked outside. He didn't say much, just handed the kid a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" the driver asked, eyes still, full of stress. Joe said, "Someone gave it to me years ago, thought you could use it." The kid unfolded the note. In faded ink, under a ring from an old coffee stain, it read, "Sometimes it's not about moving faster. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stop and breathe." The kid looked up, puzzled. Joe didn't explain. He didn't have to. Back in his rig, the highway stretched out again like a ribbon under moonlight. Long, dark, and endless. But not lonely. As Joe drove on, headlights far behind him grew smaller. Those bikes, the same ones from that parking lot weeks ago, were still out there, still learning. And Joe? He was content knowing he hadn't taught them with threats or force or fists. He taught them with patience, with presence, with a kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. Some men ride to prove who they are. Others just drive. The desert wind never really stops. It just dies down for a while, waits in the silence, then stirs the dust again when nobody's looking. And much like that wind, the road has a way of testing you when you least expect it. Jake and Troy had changed, not in the flashy way some people try to advertise. No new leather vests, no big speeches about brotherhood or transformation. But in the way they moved, the way they treated people, the way they listened. They still rode the same bikes, still wore the same patches. But the bark had quieted, and the bite, that had softened into something smarter, something deeper. They'd kept to themselves mostly. They didn't look for fights, but they didn't back away from what was right either. And when a stranger needed a wrench, a tow, or just a hand on the shoulder, they offered one, without a camera, without expecting thanks. Sometimes they talked about Joe, but not much. His name didn't need to come up for them to remember. His lesson had burned in clean. "You think we'll see him again?" Troy asked once over a diner coffee in Amarillo. Jake stared out the window for a long time before replying, "Maybe. But even if we don't, I think he's still out there, teaching someone else." The wind shook the windows softly, like it agreed. One morning, weeks later, they rolled into a small town, nestled between hills and dry brush. A place you'd miss if you blinked too long. They weren't planning to stop, but Jake caught something. In the corner of his eye, a flash of red, a familiar shade, polished and proud even under the dust. He slowed down. Troy followed his gaze, and when they circled the block, they saw it, Joe's rig. Same model, same chrome. parked perfectly at the edge of a run-down truck-stop diner. But Joe wasn't in the cab. They parked their bikes and stepped inside. The diner was quiet, all faded booths and the scent of bacon that had been cooking since sunrise. But Joe wasn't. And there, either. A waitress in her 60s stood behind the counter, wiping a mug with a rag that had probably seen too many shifts. Jake approached. "Red rig outside? You know whose it is?" She didn't even look up. "Yep, belongs to Joe. Comes through now and then. Parks out back, hikes into the canyons some days. Says the quiet helps him think." Troy chuckled softly. "Figures." Jake left his number with the waitress. "Tell him we came by. Tell him Jake and Troy said thanks." Again. They were just about to leave when something changed. Not the sky, not the road, but a voice. A young girl, maybe 9 or 10, ran into the diner breathless. "Somebody help! Our car flipped. Dad's still inside." Nobody moved. The cook looked over from the kitchen. The waitress froze with the coffee pot in hand, and a pair of tired travelers exchanged a glance, but didn't stand. Jake didn't hesitate. "Where?" The girl pointed back toward the highway. "Past the bend. We tried the brakes, but it just rolled." Jake grabbed his helmet. "Let's go." Troy followed without a word. They tore off down the road, dust flying up behind them, hearts pounding harder than their engines. The girl had jumped on Jake's bike, holding on tight, her face pale and scared but trusting. The bend came up fast, and just beyond it, they saw the wreck. A small SUV flipped onto its roof, wheels spinning lazily in the hot wind. One door hung open, the windshield was cracked, and the front end had hit a shallow ditch. A woman and a young boy were outside, the boy crying, the woman sobbing as she tried to crawl back toward the car. "My husband's in there," she cried. Jake and Troy dropped their bikes and ran, smoke curled up from the hood. There was no time to wait for help, no time to hope someone else would stop. Jake crawled in through the broken side window. The man inside was unconscious, pinned by the steering wheel, blood on his forehead, chest barely rising. Jake shouted over the noise, "Troy, I need the crowbar!" Troy ran to the bikes, grabbed the thick bar from the tool bag, and tossed it. Down. With brute strength and burning lungs, Jake wedged the bar between the seat and the wheel, gritting his teeth as he forced it backward. The metal groaned, but didn't move. Again. He shouted, pulled harder. Troy was beside him now, both men pushing against twisted steel like it was trying to hold on to death itself. Then, finally, it gave. The steering wheel snapped back just enough, and Jake grabbed the man under the arms, dragging him through the shattered window. They carried him clear as the engine gave one final sputter and burst into a small fire under the hood. They didn't look back. The family huddled together in the dirt. The girl held her father's hand, whispering, "It's okay, Daddy. They saved you." Troy stepped back, breathing hard, and looked at Jake. That was close. Jake wiped blood from his knuckles. Too close. The fire truck arrived 15 minutes later. The ambulance came after. But by then, Jake and Troy were already sitting by their bikes, sipping bottled water the waitress had run out with, shaking off the adrenaline. The woman they saved tried to thank them through tears. The man, groggy but conscious, managed a weak thumbs up before the medics loaded him into the ambulance. Jake didn't say much. He just stood there, hands on his hips, staring at the wreck. Then, from behind them, a familiar voice spoke. "Didn't think you two had it in you." They turned. Joe stood there, arms crossed, the same old calm in his face, maybe a few more creases near his eyes, but the same man, still quiet, still sharp. Jake smiled. "Guess you rubbed off on us." Joe nodded once. "Didn't have to. You were already heading this way. Just needed a reason to step up." Troy looked over. "You were watching." Joe shook his head. "Didn't need to. I heard the bikes, felt the shift. Jake walked up to him, stuck out a hand. Joe took it. They didn't speak after that, just stood together, 3 men in the sun, while the smoke faded and the sirens died down. The wind kicked up again, stirring the dust. A few days later, Jake and Troy were on the road again, but the ride felt different now, lighter, like something heavy had been left behind on that dirt shoulder. They didn't know where they were going next. Didn't have to, because now they understood the truth. Some men race to be seen, some men shout to feel heard. But the ones who really change the world, they ride steady, they speak only when needed, and when the road throws pain your way, they don't flinch. They lean in. Some stories don't start with fire. They start in silence, with a man standing alone at the edge of a road, staring at nothing, while a memory rolls by like a truck you don't hear until it's already gone. Joe had always carried things most. Men would crumble under, not just cargo, but weight, not just silence, but echoes. Every mile he put between himself and the past, the more he hoped the road might bury it. But the thing about ghosts is, they don't care how far you drive. They ride with you, quiet, patient, waiting for a crack in the noise. That crack came one morning in Nevada. Joe wasn't looking for anything, just passing through a long stretch of nothing. Dust, heat, the kind of road that chews up green drivers and spits them into the ditch. But Joe knew how to handle it. One hand on the wheel, the other on an old thermos, windows half down, country radio humming something from the 80s. He saw the sign just after mile marker 114. It wasn't big, just a rusted green board with faded letters. Red Hollow, 12 miles. The kind of place not even maps bother with. Joe's hands tightened on the wheel. Red Hollow. He hadn't thought about that name in 15 years, not since he left it behind, swearing never to go back, not since the day the road called him away, from everything that could have anchored him. But the past has a smell, and when the wind shifts just right, it finds you. He took the exit. The town hadn't changed. Still 2 gas stations, 1 blinking motel, and a diner that used to serve the best peach pie in 3 counties. The trees lining the highway were drier now, the air thinner. But time hadn't done enough to erase it. He parked the rig across from the diner and sat in the cab for a while, engine off, the ticking of the cooling metal louder than his own thoughts. Red Hollow was where he lost everything. Where he used to have a wife, a little boy, a house with blue shutters and a swing hanging from the porch, back when he was John Joe Foster, not just Joe the trucker, back when he came home for dinner instead of sleeping in a cab and counting mile markers like regrets. It was an accident that changed it all, a delivery run gone wrong, a patch of black ice, a scream on the CB radio. The other driver never made it. Joe did. But not clean. The guilt chewed him up until all that was left was the shell. Behind the wheel, his wife couldn't look at him the same. His son stopped calling him Daddy. He left before the memories could rot, thought maybe the road would wash it off, but here, now, it all came back. He stepped out of the cab and walked across the street, boots crunching over gravel like a sound from a dream. Inside the diner, the place hadn't changed. Same cracked booths, same faded menu on the wall. The waitress behind the counter blinked twice when she saw him. "Joe?" He nodded once. She put the coffee on the counter without asking. They didn't speak for a while. Finally she said, "You know he's still here, right? Your boy runs the mechanic shop now, grown man." Joe looked down into his cup. "I figured. You gonna go see him?" He didn't answer. Some things break in a way you don't try to fix. He stayed in town that night, slept in the rig, stared at the stars through the windshield. The mechanic shop was 2 blocks away. A single light burned in the garage. Joe didn't sleep. The next morning before sunrise, he walked over. The garage door was up. A young man stood over an engine, shirt stained, face sharp. Same eyes as Joe. Same way of standing, like he was leaning against the weight of everything he'd seen. Joe didn't speak. The young man didn't look up. Then, "You just gonna stand there or you want to talk?" Joe's throat felt like sand. "I didn't think you'd want to see me." His son, Eli, turned a wrench slowly. "I didn't, for a long time, but I never stopped wondering why you left." Joe exhaled, long and slow. "Because I didn't know how to carry it." "Carry what?" Joe looked him in the eyes. "The guilt, the loss, the look in your mother's eyes." Eli stepped back from the car. "She waited, for a while. Thought you'd come back when the grief passed." "I couldn't." Eli shook his head. "I know, I didn't get it then, but I've seen things since, seen how men break." Silence passed like a freight train between them. Joe said, "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know. I never stopped being proud of you." Eli wiped his hands on a rag. "You showed me how to fix things, but not how to forgive." Joe nodded. "I was still learning." Another pause. Then Eli said, "Come back tonight. I close at 8. Maybe we can talk more." Joe didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. That night they sat in the garage on old stools, talking about everything but the accident, about engines, long-haul routes. Eli's daughter, Joe's granddaughter, who liked to sit under the hood and pretend she was fixing with a plastic wrench. Joe didn't cry, but he felt something crack open. The next morning he was back on the road, the sun rising behind him. He didn't need to stay. Some things you mend with time, not words. Some miles bring you closer, even when you're driving away. He checked his messages at the next stop. One from Jake, short and simple. "Headed to Colorado. Got someone who needs help. You in?" Joe didn't reply right away, just looked at the highway stretching ahead. Then he typed back, "Always." What they didn't know was that Colorado wasn't just another ride, it was a trap. Jake and Troy had taken a side job hauling parts through the mountains. A favor for a guy they trusted, someone who said the route was safe, quick, nothing to worry about. But halfway up the pass, they found themselves blocked by a fake road crew, men with no ID, no equipment, and too many guns. Troy knew trouble when he saw it. Jake stepped off his bike slowly. "We just passing through," he said. One of the men grinned. "Not today, you ain't." They tried to play it cool, but the trap was tight. Radios jammed, phones dead. 4 men surrounded them, armed and ready, no cops for miles. What the crew didn't know was this. You don't corner a man who's learned from someone like Joe. Jake had spent enough time watching, listening, learning how to stay calm when the heat rises. "How to wait for the crack in the plan," Troy whispered. "We can't take all 4, Jake nodded, "but we don't have to." He let the leader talk. Let them get confident. Let them underestimate him, just like they used to. Then, behind the trucks, they heard the growl of a diesel engine. Joe's red rig came around the bend, slow, controlled, beautiful. It didn't stop. It roared between the gunmen and the bikes, scattering them like leaves. Jake moved fast. He ducked low, swept a leg, and dropped one of the crew. Troy tackled another. By the time the smoke cleared and Joe stepped out of the cab, the rest of the ambushers were either running or groaning on the ground. Joe looked at Jake. "Thought you had it under control." Jake grinned. "I did. Just needed a little punctuation." Troy picked up a dropped walkie and spoke into it. "Might want to call the sheriff. We got some cleanup." An hour later, with cuffs on and stories told, the 3 men stood by the rig again. Jake said, "You didn't have to come." Joe looked down the road. "Yes, I did. Because that's what the road teaches you. Not just how to ride, but how to return. How to carry not just your own weight, but someone else's when they can't." Jake looked at the sky. Clouds were gathering. Rain, maybe, but his heart felt clearer than it had in years. Joe had faced his ghosts. Jake had faced his fear. Troy had found something worth protecting. And the road, it kept stretching ahead, unfinished, unbroken, and waiting. Sometimes the road doesn't just call, it whispers. It doesn't ask you to run toward danger. It dares you to show up when it matters most. Joe didn't talk about family much, not even to Jake and Troy, who had become as close to brothers as blood ever made. But there was a weight to the way he'd glance at his phone, the way he paused when kids passed by. Something half buried in the gravel of his heart. Jake had noticed. You don't ride that many miles with a man and miss the small tells. It was in a diner in eastern Utah, halfway between nowhere and a canyon that didn't have a name, that it all came out. Joe's phone buzzed. He stared at it too long. Jake nudged him. Everything all right? Joe didn't answer right away. He finally said, It's Eli, my boy. Troy looked up from his plate. Something wrong? Joe set the phone down slowly. His daughter's gone missing. My granddaughter. Silence swallowed the booth like a low fog. Jake sat back. Tell us everything. Joe nodded. Her name was Lily, 14 years old, bright, brave, head full of engine diagrams and old stories about Grandpa. Joe the trucker. Stories Eli only recently began to tell her. She'd been heading home from school in Red Hollow 2 days ago and never arrived. Her phone was found smashed near the edge of a rest stop an hour away. No signs, no ransom, just absence. Joe's eyes were hard now. Still. The kind of still that happens before a storm. Jake stood up without a word. Troy followed. They were already walking toward the bikes when Joe said quietly, You don't have to come. Jake turned. You're wrong about that. They rode straight through the night. No music, no chatter. Just headlight beams slicing through the dark like searchlights across a black ocean. Each hour passed like a promise, one they couldn't afford to break. When they rolled into Red Hollow, Eli was waiting. He looked thinner, worn. But when he saw Joe step out of the cab, something in his face cracked. Not weakness, but relief, like someone else had picked up a piece of the weight. This is Jake and Troy, Joe said. Eli nodded. Thank you for coming. They sat in the garage, maps spread out over the hood of an old Dodge, routes, GPS pings, what little the sheriff had found, which was next to nothing. Jake tapped a point on the map. The phone was found here? Eli nodded. Right off Highway 63, near the canyon. Troy squinted. Remote, no cameras, no houses. That feels planned. Joe stared at the line on the map. There's a fuel station near there, not official. Old biker stop. Might have seen something. Jake and Troy exchanged a glance. We'll check it out. The station was run down, a relic from another time. Gas pumps with cracked faces. A tired man in a trucker cap behind the counter, thumbing through a magazine that was older than the kid at the register. Jake walked in slow. Friendly, but direct. Seen a girl out here 2 days ago? Red backpack, maybe scared, maybe with someone she shouldn't be. The man's eyes narrowed. Maybe, maybe not. Troy stepped forward, not aggressive, but big, present, the kind of presence that made people tell the truth. The man swallowed. There was a van, out-of-state plates. No reason to be here. Girl looked nervous. I tried to ask. Guy driving waved me off. Didn't think much of it then. Jake leaned in. What direction? North. Took the old mine road. Nobody goes up there. Roads washed out. But Jake already had his helmet on. They rode fast. The kind of fast that burns fear into fuel. The mine road was exactly what they were told. Broken, narrow, dangerous. But the van tracks were clear. Dust disturbed. Recent. They followed them up into the hills until the path split around a bluff. Joe slowed, then pointed. There, a clearing, a rusted trailer half covered in tarps. And the van, Jake stopped his bike slowly. No rush, no panic. You don't kick a snake nest loud. Troy circled left, Joe right inside the trailer. Voices, a man. Another one laughing, and then a sound. Muffled, a cry. Jake didn't wait. He kicked the door in with one heavy boot. The inside exploded into chaos. Two men startled, one reaching for something under the couch, but Joe was already there. His fist moved like a piston. One man went down without a sound. Troy grabbed the other, slammed him into the wall, held him with one arm while patting him down for weapons. Jake moved to the back. A small room, dirty mattress, and Lily, duct tape over her mouth. Eyes wide, but alive. He knelt gently. "Hey, I'm Jake. We're friends of your grandpa. You're safe now." She nodded, shaking. Back at the garage, Eli wept when he saw her. Lily ran to him, buried in his arms. Joe stood back, watching, hands clenched at his sides, heart trembling in his chest. When Eli looked up, he locked eyes with Joe, and for the first time he said it out loud. "Thank you, Dad." Joe closed his eyes. Just for a second. But it was enough. A week later, the van men were behind bars. The sheriff called it one of the cleanest recoveries he'd ever seen. Didn't ask too many questions about how exactly the rescue unfolded, didn't want to know. Jake, Troy, and Joe stayed another few days, just long enough to help Eli reinforce the house, put better locks on the garage, and teach Lily how to throw a punch if she ever needed to again. Then it was time. Lily hugged Joe so hard he had to blink back something he didn't have a name for. "I'll write you," she said. Joe nodded. "I'll write back." As they rode out of Red Hollow, the sun was setting, a warm gold against the hills. Jake rode up beside Joe, helmet visor up. "She's tough," Joe nodded. "Tougher than I ever was." Troy grinned. "She gets it from you." Joe didn't answer. He didn't need to. They hit the open highway just as the stars began to burn. Through the last light, no destination, no plan, just the next road, the next story. And somewhere in the dark, behind them, the ghosts were finally quiet. Because for the first time in a long time, Joe wasn't running from the past. He was riding toward something. The thing about the past is, it doesn't just fade, it circles, like a hawk over desert roads, like a patch of oil you thought you'd cleaned up, until your tires hit it, and you start sliding backward. Jake knew this, knew it the way a man knows the heat of steel after years of welding, or the taste of blood when words go wrong. So when he saw the rider in the mirror, way back on that straight Nevada stretch, something in his spine went stiff. Not fear. Not yet. But something old. Bike was black, sleek, fast, not factory. Modified. Custom frame, matte tank, no chrome. Whoever was riding it knew how to build for silence. Troy noticed too. "You know him?" he asked, visor up. Jake didn't answer right away. "Not yet," he said, but his voice was tight. The rider stayed back. Far enough to not be a threat, close enough to not be forgotten. They passed through 3 towns, took side roads, stopped at a diner in Junction Springs. Still there, Troy leaned in. "He's tailing you." Jake stirred his coffee. "I know." Joe finally spoke. "You ready to talk about it?" Jake looked out the window. His name's Cutter, or used to be. Joe waited. "He was with my old crew, back when I ran with the 8 Devils." Troy's brow furrowed. "Thought that crew disbanded." Jake gave a small, dark laugh. "Not exactly. Some of us walked away. Some didn't. Cutter stayed, took over." Joe nodded once. "He's not here to catch up." "No," Jake said. "He's here for me." They left the diner without speaking. The rider followed, always the same distance behind. Until they hit Drywell Pass, a long, narrow stretch with steep rock faces on both sides. No turnoffs, no traffic. It was there that the rider accelerated. Troy reached for his sidearm, but Jake raised a hand. "No." The black bike pulled alongside. Cutter's helmet was matte black, visor down, but Jake didn't need to see his face. They both slowed, dust rising in low spirals behind them. Jake stepped off his bike. So did Cutter. The air between them felt like it might break. Joe and Troy stood back, not scared, just watching, ready. Cutter finally spoke. Voice rough, flat, the kind of voice that had lost its music long ago. "You left," he said. Jake nodded. "Yeah, you ran. I chose better." Cutter tilted his head. "You were one of us." Jake stepped closer. "No, I was trapped. With you. Big difference." Cutter's jaw twitched. "You think you're better now, just 'cause you ride with new friends and save lost girls?" Jake didn't move. "I don't think I'm better. I'm just not like you." Cutter's hand twitched near his belt. "Not a gun, something smaller, a blade maybe." Jake didn't flinch. Cutter took a slow breath. "You broke code." Jake laughed once, bitter. "The code was broken when you started burning towns for pay. You walked out on blood. I walked out on rot." They stood like that for a long moment. A coyote howled far off. A dust devil danced between them, like the road itself didn't know who to choose. Cutter finally said, "You left us to die." Jake's voice dropped low. "I left so I wouldn't become you." Then Joe stepped forward, calm, measured, like a man walking through a field of snakes. "You want to fight, you've got one," Joe said, "but it won't be just Jake." Troy stood beside him, big, solid. A wall. Cutter looked between them, weighed the odds, then, slowly, he took a step back. "I'll be seeing you again," he said. Jake didn't smile. "No, you won't." Cutter turned, mounted his bike, and rode off. The black shape disappeared over the ridge. Jake didn't move for a while. Troy finally said, "That the end of it?" Jake shook his head. "That was a warning. The storm comes later." Joe nodded. "Then we'll be ready." They rode in silence for hours after that, but something had shifted. A wire had been cut. A shadow pulled loose from the ground. The past wasn't done. 2 days later, they got word from a contact in Arizona. The 8 devils, or what was left of them, were moving again, gun-running, extortion, and they were looking for Jake. He'd turned his back on their world. But some men see redemption as betrayal. Joe sat by the fire that night, watching sparks float up into the stars. "You sure you want this fight?" he asked. Jake stared into the flames. "No." "But you'll take it?" Jake nodded. "Because it's not just about me anymore. They weren't just 3 men anymore. They were something heavier, a force with purpose, with lines they wouldn't cross, and fists for those who did. They began planning, not revenge, not war, preparation. Because when the 8 devils came, then Jake wouldn't be the only one they'd try to break. They'd come for Troy, for Joe, maybe even for Eli and Lily. And that was a mistake, because if there's one thing more dangerous than a lone rider with a past, it's 3 men who've learned how to protect each other. 3 men who don't run anymore. They ride together. The thing about old enemies is they don't show up like storms. They don't roll in loud. They come quiet, like mold under the floorboards, like wolves. You don't know they're here until the first throat's gone. Jake knew that. That's why the moment the gas station clerk in Westwell asked if he wanted devil fuel with a wink, he knew the devils were already in town. Troy didn't like it. He stood taller than the clerk, towering really, but all he said was, "You got regular?" The clerk shrugged. "You want clean? Go east." Jake paid in cash. They didn't speak until they were back on the road. Joe said, "They're planting flags." Jake nodded. "And bait." Troy checked the side mirror. "That was a message. They know where we are." That night, they stopped early, made camp off the highway beneath a stretch of abandoned wind turbines. The desert wind whispered through, the blades creaking like old bones, a sound that made men listen more than sleep. Joe was cleaning his rifle, not because he thought he'd use it, because it was time to. "They're not just watching anymore," he said. "They're moving." Jake sat by the fire, quiet, focused. "The devils don't warn twice," he said. "Next time someone doesn't wake up." Troy nodded. "So we hit first." Jake looked up. "No, we bait them." Joe raised an eyebrow. "Turn their game around." Jake's voice was low, sharp. "They're used to control in fear. Let's show them what fear looks like when it learns how to punch back." They had two choices, hide or hunt. They chose neither. They lured. It started with Jake making calls. Old friends who'd turned their backs on the crew long ago. Mechanics, veterans. A woman named Lena who once pulled Jake out of a gunfight with her bare hands and a belt of C4. Each of them owed Jake something. Each of them came. By the time they reached the town of Fairwater, a quiet pit stop with a truck depot and one radio tower, the crew had grown. Not an army, but something better. People who understood what it meant to lose something and still stand. Troy fortified the truck yard. Joe set up surveillance. Lena scouted roads. Jake waited, because he knew Cutter would come. He knew Cutter wouldn't send a message. Cutter was the message. 2 nights later, just past 2 a.m., the first devil bike rolled in. They didn't hide it. They wanted to be seen. Black leather, red skull patches, 6 men, 2 trucks, loud, ugly. Jake stood in the depot parking lot, arms crossed. They circled him like hyenas. A man stepped down from the lead truck. It wasn't Cutter, but Jake knew him. Ridge, face like a knife, all bone and cigarette smoke. "You've been making noise," Ridge said. Jake didn't flinch. "You looking for quiet? Go to a library." Ridge smirked. "Funny. You always were funny. Right up until that night in Hollow Creek." Jake's face darkened. "Don't talk about Hollow Creek." Ridge stepped closer. "You left us there." Jake's voice dropped. "I left you when you lit that school bus on fire." Troy and Joe emerged behind Jake, quiet as the wind. Ridge looked them over. "You brought friends. That's cute." Lena's voice rang out from the shadows. "We're not friends. We're the reason you're not leaving here smiling." Ridge turned, saw her, shotgun in hand, calm as ice. The air cracked. Ridge raised his hands slowly. "I didn't come to fight," he said. Jake stepped closer. "Then leave. Tell Cutter if he wants to finish this, he comes himself. No more rats." Ridge's face hardened. "He'll come, but you'll wish he hadn't." He turned, motioned to the others, and they left. Not like they were beaten, like they were setting the table. Joe broke the silence after they disappeared. "That wasn't a threat." Jake nodded. "That was a promise. They knew they had hours, maybe less." Joe got to work reinforcing doors. Troy pulled out gear from the truck. Flares, chains, motion alarms. Lena set traps. Not deadly, but enough to send a clear message. Jake sat alone in the cab of his truck, looking at the old picture in the glove box. Him, his brother. A woman he once loved, long gone now. Ghosts. But tonight wasn't about ghosts. It was about keeping the living safe. And when dawn came, the first bullet did too. It pinged off the depot sign, clean and cold. The attack wasn't loud. It was surgical. The devils came from 3 sides. Coordinated smoke bombs first, then fire, but what they didn't expect was preparation. Lena's flares turned night into daylight. Joe's motion alarms blared, forcing them out of cover. Troy's size made him immovable. He dragged 2 riders from their bikes like ragdolls, and Jake moved like a storm. He didn't use guns unless he had to, just fists, boots, and 30 years of knowing exactly where to hit. Ridge tried to run. Jake caught him near the tower. They fought in the dust, both men grunting, bleeding. But Jake was faster, smarter, more focused. He pinned Ridge, breath heaving. "Where's Cutter?" he demanded. Ridge spat blood. "Already gone. He never planned to fight. Just wanted to see how far you'd go." Jake's eyes narrowed. "So, what's the end game?" Ridge coughed. "He's going for your past, not your face." And then Jake understood. It wasn't about him. It was about Lily, about Eli, about everyone he cared about. He dropped Ridge. "You lose." Ridge smiled through cracked teeth. "Then why are you scared?" Jake didn't answer. He ran, Back to the others, back to the truck. He climbed in and started the engine, gravel spitting as the tires turned. Joe climbed into the passenger seat. "Where?" "Red Hollow," Jake growled. "They're going after the only thing I've got left to lose." Troy mounted his bike, pulling ahead. Lena loaded up behind. They rode hard, faster than the law allowed, faster than fear, because Cutter had made one mistake. He thought Jake was trying to protect himself, but Jake was never the hero of his story. He was the wall, and this time, Cutter was about to slam into it. The wind had a different sound that night. It wasn't just speed anymore. It was warning, a low whisper through the hills that made even the strongest trees lean just a little harder, like they were bracing. Jake didn't speak much as the miles blurred beneath them. His hands were tight on the wheel, his eyes sharper than they'd been in years. He had always known it would end like this. Men like him don't get sunsets and soft chairs. They don't retire. They ride until something catches up, either the law, the road, or the past. Tonight it was all three. They reached Red Hollow just after midnight. It was quiet, too quiet. Lily's foster home, the little white house with the porch swing. Jake had rebuilt last fall, sat in the distance, lights still on, but Jake could feel it in his gut. They were already here. He parked the truck behind the old church lot. Joe and Troy dismounted behind him. Lena crouched low, checking the wind. "She's inside," Lena said. "2 bikes out front, 1 truck parked a block away. That's their extraction." Jake nodded. "Then we cut off the exit." Joe looked over. "We go in loud?" Jake shook his head. "No, I go in alone." Troy stepped forward. "Not a chance." Jake turned. His voice was firm but calm. "You all have lives left to live. I'm not asking you to throw those away. We chose this," Troy said. Jake looked him in the eye. "And I'm choosing for you now. Stay with the truck. If I don't come back in 5, you go in. But give me 5. Joe stared hard. "You're not trying to win this fight, are you?" Jake's eyes softened. "I'm trying to end it." He stepped away before they could argue, walked through the back alley like a man going to meet something older than death. When he reached the porch, he saw Cutter, sitting in the old rocking chair like he owned the place. Cutter didn't smile, didn't stand, just said, "Took you long enough." Jake stepped up. "You knew I'd come." Cutter nodded. "You've always had a weakness for little things. Girls with scared eyes, friends who can't shoot straight. Innocence." Jake's jaw clenched. "Let her go." Cutter stood. He looked older now, not weaker, just worn, like a blade used too many times. "She's in the back, with one of mine. You step wrong. She disappears before you reach the door." Jake didn't blink. "Then make your point." Cutter tilted his head. "You left me to rot. You walked out and took the heart of the crew with you. These boys, they're shadows now. I gave them orders. You gave them hope. They followed you when they should have feared me." Jake stepped closer. "I didn't steal anything. They came because they were tired of dying for nothing." Cutter chuckled. "And what are you dying for tonight?" Jake's eyes didn't waver. "Her." There was a silence between them, not empty, heavy. Cutter pulled a gun from his belt. Not fast, not threatening, just final. He pointed it at Jake's chest. Jake didn't move. "If I shoot you now," Cutter said, "this ends. You bleed, I vanish, and she forgets your name in a year." Jake nodded. "But if I kill you, they all come for her, for Joe, for Troy, for everyone I've ever tried to protect." Cutter narrowed his eyes. "So what are you offering?" Jake took a breath. "Me." He held out his hands. "I walk away with you. No fight. No blood. Just me. You get your justice. You get your pride, and you leave everyone else out of it." Cutter hesitated. Jake kept going. "You kill me in front of her, she'll grow up knowing what men like you do. Or you walk away with me, and she never hears another word about this night. She lives." Cutter looked down. His hand shook just slightly. Then he nodded. Jake turned just for a moment. "Joe," he called into the dark. "It's done. She's safe." He didn't look back to see if they were coming, didn't wait to see if the others would follow. He walked down the street with Cutter. Not like a prisoner, like a man who had finally made peace with the road. He didn't see Lily step onto the porch, didn't hear her whisper his name, but he would have smiled if he had, because for the first time in years, Jake did what no one expected him to do. He saved himself by giving up everything else. They found his body 2 counties over 3 days later, gunshot to the chest, bike parked beside a cliff, no sign of Cutter, no sign of a fight, just peace. Joe buried him near the old canyon. No headstone, just a gear from Jake's first truck, rusted and strong. Lily grew up and kept the porch swing in perfect shape. Troy named his first son after Jake. And Joe, he kept riding, because legends don't rest. They ride on.